we're now going to do wet on wet. The key to wet on wet is that you have damp paper. Now, if we were doing a huge area, like our entire sheet of paper, we're putting down a wash that's going to cover everything, we could spray it down with a spray bottle. Right now, we're just going to make a little swatch. So we're going to rinse out our brush. Grab some clean water if you're using 2 cups. It looks like both of you are. I knew that you might be fastidious people. And you are going to trust in your hand and your mind to paint an area that is mostly a box. Also, you can lean back and forth to see the shine, or move your paper back and forth. But eventually you kind of just learn to like watch where the edge of your brush is and be like, I know my water is going to stay there because that's how watercolor paper works. And we're just making this little area damp. The amount of water you put here is going to affect how your color flows around. The less water, the less far your color will travel. If this is a true puddle on your paper, where it's like sitting via the surface tension, it's going to spread out quite a bit. What I'm going to do now is, just for dramatic effect, I'm going to brush my brush right against, just directly from the well. So I'm just taking directly from here rather than my little wash that I've made over here. And I am just going to touch it to my puddle. Now, I could have been more dramatic and not picked this blue, because this blue is a slow traveler. But I can now brush through this whole area and get a nice saturated wash that fills this corner. If I picked my cadmium red, it would have went wild. Maybe I'll do that next. Different pigments travel at different rates. It has to do with like the physical shape of them, but also the size. And something to do with like positively and negatively charged stuff. But that's a lot of extra science. I like science, but I will probably say incorrect things if I try to remember it all for this class. And I would rather not be the unreliable narrator of watercolor here. Alright, I'm gonna grab some of this red that I have. So now when I touch this, you'll see that spread out a lot faster. This red loves to travel. So some pigments are going to be much more excitable in that way, and will just flow nicely into wherever you put them, and you have to do less actual mixing. This is a really good way to deal with large spaces. If you are, say, you want a whole floor space covered evenly with one color for your first wash, coming in and getting it all wet beforehand can be a good way to apply that color. You can also apply an even wash of a more saturated color this way by going directly from your pans. You can also create that first thing that we did where we like mixed it up and added water to it. That's called a wash as well. Once again, we have a vocabulary issue here in watercolor where the puddle that we mix up with the color is a wash. The thing that we put down on the paper is also a wash. Wash essentially is just water. It's already diluted color, essentially, whether that is in your pan or on your paper. And sometimes people will say, put a wash over this whole area, and what they mean is like an even field of color. over that area. So this can be a good way to get that nice evenness. If you were trying to do an even wall, like a wall that you just want all one color, this can be a good way to do it. Keep in mind that if you create your wash first, you'll want it just a tad more saturated with color than if you were doing wet on dry, because you are adding water to it on your paper as well. If you go too light though, you can always come in, let it dry, do a second wash, or you can come in, add pigment, and even it out. So that is the benefit of wet on wet, is that you have a lot of time to work with the color and get it nice and even. It can look a lot more even than any of these wet on dry examples. Here in this wet on dry, you can really start seeing that outlining come through now that it's dried. You can also do more than one color in a wet on wet wash. So if you haven't already mixed up a second color and created a little puddle somewhere on your paper, go ahead and do that. I'm going to make like a magenta-y one over here. Maybe it's just going to be this more purple color. Maybe I don't. Oh, no, this is the if I added pink to it, it would be more magenta. I'm happy with this color though. I'm going to mix up a little bit more of my blue. I tend to do a lot more wet on wet painting. I'm a more expressive painter, and I like to do a lot of what are called bicolor to multicolor washes. So, all right, time to embrace more than one color at a time. This is a bicolor wash, and I'm going to start by just grabbing my clean water and creating another like swatch sized area. So this is also a wet on wet technique. It's just a little different. And I'm going to pick some of my first color. I'm going to go first with the blue because I've worked with these paints enough to know that the blue travels a little bit less. And I'm going to dot it in here. This is the difference, by the way, of coming in with a wash where the blue has already been mixed with water, than up here where it's coming straight from my pan, it will spread out just a little bit more. And I've dotted it in polka dots. Now I'm going to pick up my magenta color here and dot it in as well. My magenta will travel and push things around. You'll notice even that it pushes like all of the fluid in a direction as it's traveling, because there is that like energy that is traveling through from the paint, from like your daub in your paintbrush. So I can proceed to add in these dots until I like the wash that I've achieved. This can be a fun way to get that like very bloomy watercolor effect. Each of these little dots, when they like burst out in the water, is called a bloom. And you can either learn to love them and embrace them and do them on purpose, or have them become your worst enemies. I'll show you an example of a bloom that could be accidental here in a moment. I'm going to give you some time though to try this multicolor wash thing. If I can get this out of the, there you can see it a little better now that the light isn't shining on it. It will kind of tend to collect at the edges of your shape. One way to deal with this is to like get a paper towel and wick it out on the edge. Alright. I grabbed some paper towels from the back of the classroom. Honestly, these institutional like brown paper towels are terrible for doing this. The best ones, actually Catherine, you have some here, are things that they send in like takeaway food. They are extremely good paper towels for the use of this. Or, you know, like a nice quality towel from a roll also works. And you can use them kind of for a really long time, so you don't have to be wasteful. Or you could be a normal person, I guess, and throw it away after you're done. But I just let it dry out on my desk. So if I have a bunch of water collecting here, I can touch the edge of my paper towel. With these, I tend to fold them up so that I'm getting enough absorption. And I can touch the edges and just soak up any of that extra moisture. It will soak up some of the color, but as long as you've allowed it to sit for a bit, it shouldn't be too bad. And then I'll just set that off to the side and let it dry. Once it's dried into the paper towel, your chances of like doing a lot of color transfer from blotting and stuff are pretty low. You would have to have quite a bit of pigment on there for it to transfer color. One thing that you can get when you're doing wet on wet examples is artifacts like this that's happened here, where there's kind of like these wispy-ish edges and it's a little uneven in the surface. To me, that's why I love watercolor and love using it. Of course, I'm using it to paint like nature, and so this variation is nice to me. If you want to even that out, just watch it as it dries, and if you notice it collecting pigment in any area, come in with your brush and brush it out. You can also learn to balance your water so that you don't have so much water on your paper or so much that you're adding that it dries unevenly. Because this is just an artifact of it drying unevenly right here as well too. One thing that we didn't do today is what's called sizing our paper. Sizing your paper is when you take your watercolor paper and you either staple it down to a surface or you tape it down to a surface, and then you take a larger brush, you get it all wet, and then let it completely dry. That helps get out any of the like buckling that might be happening to your paper if you've added a bunch of water to it, and it gives you a smoother surface to paint on. We don't end up really doing that in this class because it takes a lot more time. It's something that you kind of want to prep like the night before, because you want that paper completely dry before you start painting it again. You can tell, by the way, if your paper is dry enough to add a second layer, is if you take, I usually just end up using like a little bit of like the back of my pinky knuckle, and if I touch it and it feels significantly cooler than room temperature, it is still wet, even if I'm not getting any paint on my fingers. If it's still that cool, like this blue, nothing is lifting up on my finger, but it is still too wet to add a second layer on. So you want to wait for it to be completely dry. So that is wet on wet. And there is another wet on wet technique we're going to do in a bit, but I want to give you some time to practice that.